Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today I will be discussing the Batleth and whether or not it would be a useful weapon in combat. Now, before I begin, let me just tell everyone that I have indeed seen both the videos of Shadiversity as well as TPLA on this topic, and I will be linking them in the description if you want some alternate opinions to mine. And I am also happy to receive any opinion that someone would like to refer me to in the comments section below. Now, that being said, let me begin. So, the Batleth, of course, is a weapon that comes from Star Trek. Specifically, I believe it was first used in Star Trek The Next Generation, and the design of a weapon consists of a curved piece of metal that has two main segments to it: an outer ring that has two spikes and three grips, and then an inner ring that is interconnected with the outer ring and also has two spikes as well as a sharpened surface all along it. Now, of course, this is a weapon made for a fictional combat situation for television, so it is obviously not going to be necessarily the most optimized weapon for combat. I will admit that. And in addition to that, in canon, the weapon also has a significant amount of ceremonial significance. However, that being said, when you actually look at how the weapon is used on the show, what we see is that the Klingons who use the weapons mostly end up using it against enemies who do not have significantly sized weapons for close combat of their own. In other words, it's not as if they're fighting someone who's a master with a long sword or a halberd or a pike or anything like that in usual combat. Now, then again, in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, there's a Jem'Hadar, and they do use an axe halberd-like weapon that is used throughout there, and apparently the Klingons adopt that as well as they encounter it. However, that being said, most people that the Klingons would encounter, which would be the Romulans or the Federation or even the Cardassians, in canon are not known to frequently carry large weapons. In other words, if you have a weapon and you attack an opponent who's not well armored and who's not carrying a weapon of his own for close combat to defend himself, then the Batleth is actually going to be effective regardless of its inefficiencies. It's sort of like picking up some random tool and attacking an unarmed person. You're going to have some sort of advantage. Even if, let's say, it's a lamp that you're picking up and you're hitting somebody overhead with a lamp. Even though that's not an optimized fighting tool, it's going to give you a certain degree of advantage. Therefore, in context of not fighting against opponents who also are significantly armed, in other words, when the Klingons are fighting against most external opponents that they would encounter in Star Trek, it is an effective weapon. Now, that being said, against other Klingons, the Klingons actually don't only use a Batleth, they actually have a very wide variety of weapons, including weapons that resemble more conventional types of swords. So it's not as if it's their only weapon. And however, it seems to me that, as the name implies, Batleth, sword or blade of honor, it is the main ceremonial weapon for the Klingons that has a religious significance to them, which is why presumably they use it, since it is associated with their mythology of Kahless. And Therefore, it has a type of significance that lends itself to being used as a weapon, even if it is not necessarily the most efficient weapon. However, if you're actually going to be in combat with a bat'leth, how would you go about using it? And the way I would think that you would go about using it certainly would not be the same way you would use, let's say, a long sword or a type of polearm, since the shape of a weapon is completely different, which means the technique that you're going to use is also going to be completely different. I know this, so as an expert martial artist myself, I decided to actually think about this and think about some ways that such a weapon could actually be used more effectively than just swinging it around. And that is, of course, I began to realize a few interesting things about it. And one thing I would say that I noticed is that defensively, if you're going one-on-one in a fight, it's actually pretty good against most other close combat weapons, especially if you're at a medium hand-to-hand range. And that's a range where it's you're not right on top of someone. Maybe you're just outside of a hand fighting distance. In other words, outside of the range of a punch, but maybe still inside of a range of a kick or of moderate length hand-to-hand weapons, such as certain types of axes for combat, certain swords, and in this case, the bat'leth. So if you're in that range, when somebody comes in swinging in with a weapon, it's actually very easy to use a bat'leth to parry, since presumably the center of gravity of a bat'leth, especially if you're holding it with your hands on the opposite grips rather than on the center grip, or both on one side grip, just if your hands are on one side grip and on the other side grip, then the center of gravity of the bat'leth is going to be in between your hands, which is going to lend itself well for having a good control of the weapon. Now, when somebody hits the bat'leth, because you're obviously going to parry, why wouldn't you? It will be a very good parry to the point where you can theoretically pivot the weapon to attack with the other side of a weapon. What you should do is you should sort of maybe deflect the blow with one side of a weapon and attack with the other side of a weapon. And the way I thought about this is because I have some experience with Ryukyu Kenpo, and there's certain techniques where you entrap your opponent's hand with one hand and then you attack with the other hand. And that's essentially what you can do with a bat'leth, because a bat'leth, between the 2 points, there's a little divot which can be used as a type of a hook, and you can hook somebody's weapon, or you can use the center blade of a weapon to deflect an attack or to block an attack, and then swing the weapon around to stab with the other side. Now, is the shape of a bat'leth the most optimizable shape for that specific type of technique? The answer, I would say, is no, it is not. However, that being said, it certainly is the type of attack that I would say is most likely with a bat'leth. Also, the curved shape of the blades can be used to sort of get around an opponent's defenses as well in some ways. So I'm seeing a strong resemblance to the falques used by the ancient Dacians in the sort of forward-shaped curve of the blade, which of course was moderately effective against the armor that the Romans wore at the time, and actually led to them changing the type of equipment that they used. And also, the crescent shape of a bat'leth is similar to a number of ancient and medieval Chinese weapons, that use that for also parrying or also as a cutting surface in some contexts. So the actual form of a bat'leth itself, the actual shapes that are used, do exist in real-life weapons, such as the points and the hooks can be seen in medieval European polearms, as well as in inner African weapons that sometimes have some very interesting designs to them. So in other words, while it's not an optimized weapon, it certainly is not a useless weapon. As long as you really think about how to use it, you can actually get some good techniques off with it. Now let's think about it in a different context. Let's say there's a large crowd of soldiers in a battle. Would the bat'leth be good as a uniform weapon? I would say it's not. I would say that it's more of a specialist weapon and not very good as a uniform weapon. And I'll give a few examples here. Let's say you've got the bat'leth up against a tower shield and sword formation like that used by the ancient Romans, and you've got a bunch of soldiers armed with bat'leths. I don't think that that's going to be terribly effective against the tower shield and sword formation, as the bat'leth wouldn't really be able to have the force to break through the shield, nor would it really be able to counteract the swift attack of the Romans that requires them to get into a very close range in order to attack, at which point if the Roman soldier is allowed to get into that range, then that's too close for the bat'leth to be used effectively. And another instance, classic shield and spear formations against the bat'leth. The problem here is that the spears outrange the bat'leth, and although in a one-on-one fight that wouldn't actually be that much of a problem because of the good parrying capacity of a bat'leth, if you're doing this in a group setting, it's actually going to be a huge problem because the bat'leth doesn't have that large of a blocking surface so that it can block a number of spears coming in at the same time. That's not something that you would be able to do very well with a bat'leth. I'm not saying that it's impossible. However, the skill needed to do that would be a lot more than the skill needed to effectively circumvent that type of defense. So I would say that type of attack, I'm sorry. So I would say that that is not what a bat'leth would be effective against. And just another point, close combat pike formations, same problem with spear and shield, except it's even worse. Since the bat'leth would not be able to get into range in order to do an effective counterattack, and also would be held off by a wall of pikes. So, is it good in one-on-one combat? Yeah. Is it good in group combat? No, it's not. Maybe if you've got a formation of soldiers that use a variety of other weapons that are more suited for that type of combat, and then you maybe have a couple of guys carrying a bat'leth for special situations, for maybe when you've broken through the main defense of the enemy, perhaps, then it might be useful, but still it's not an optimized weapon, so I would say you'd have to modify the shape of it significantly for that situation to arise. And finally, a final point I would say about the bat'leth is, again, as a two-handed weapon, if the hands are not directly adjacent to each other, it's actually a lot more difficult to circumvent or to disarm than, let's say, a longsword. And by that I mean, with a longsword, you can simply attack the center of gravity, or you can attack your opponent's hands since they're all in one place. You can, let's say, do a shield bash if you've got a shield, and then attack while your opponent's weapon is knocked out of the way. And you can do that with most weapons, really. But with a bat'leth, that's going to still be possible, but a lot more difficult, since the way the weapon is held puts it in a central position. It's sort of like, let's say, fighting someone with a bow staff, where a bow staff has a distributed grip, the way you would usually use it in fighting, and therefore pushing the weapon aside and attacking is not as viable a strategy as, let's say, a quarterstaff, where your grip is mostly focused on one end. Now, I'm not saying that a bowstaff is better than a quarterstaff, or that a bat'leth is better than a longsword. That by no means is what I'm saying, since what I'm trying to say is that a certain type of counter-offensive against such weapons would be less effective against other weapons. That's what I'm saying. So all weapons have their own strengths and weaknesses, and that's what I'm really exploring here. So, final analysis: is the bat'leth an optimized fighting tool? No. Is the bat'leth a usable weapon that has some nuance of technique and could theoretically be used well in single combat? Yes, it actually could be. And finally, is the bat'leth good in large-scale group combat? No. However, that being said, if we're looking at Star Trek, a lot of it happens in space, so you're going to be running around corridors of spaceships, so having a large polearm probably is not the ideal weapon for that situation. So I guess it works where it is, and it also isn't encountering many other strong weapons against it when it comes to close combat. So I'm thinking it's fine. However, if I had to redesign it, if I had to choose whether to keep it the way it is or to redesign it to be a more effective weapon, I would certainly redesign it. Since it is definitely not an optimized weapon. So anyway, I think that's where I'll end my discussion here. If anyone out there is interested into discussing this further with me, or strongly disagrees, or perhaps strongly agrees, or perhaps has some other useful information to share, I am happy to hear it. Just share it in the comments section below. And I will also be putting in my description some links to some other videos that I think are interesting. So anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.